Let's see. Oh, I think we started recording. Hey, welcome, Pastor David. Would you mind just introducing yourself real briefly or
Sure,
longly or whatever?
sure, we can do it. My name is David Carter. I am the director or pastor of youth ministries here at Fellowship Community Church here in Centennial, Colorado. I've been doing youth ministry for like 20 years, and one of the things that I love is being able to help young men and women, teenagers, meet Jesus and follow Him. And honestly, like how this conversation is going to go, I don't want this just to be an experiential thing, but rather like it's really important that we know the facts and that we base our faith on something more than just our mere subjective experience. So I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm already kind of starting to show my hand in what we're going to be talking about today. But yeah, thanks for having me come and chat with you.
Yeah, no. Pastor David was and still is one of my mentors in youth ministry, and I thought to exercise his brain on a topic of apologetics. So I was going to ask you a few questions, and then I guess we'll go from there. So some of my youth wonder about a few questions about God, and they might have some non-believing friends too. So this could be helpful for any of them. But I guess just kind of the first thing is kind of a general one, like how do I know God is for real? Will I ever know for sure? What do you think about that?
That's actually a really important question to be asking. And I mean, it gets into some deep things like how do I know anything? But I wanted to kind of phrase this the way that one guy whose name James Warner Wallace or Jay Warner Wallace, he talks about this a good bit in his books. But like the first question I would ask as we engage this question, which is the right way to do anything, ask a question about a question, right? Make it as confusing as possible. But the first question I would ask is like, why are you a Christian? If you're watching this and you're thinking through like, why are you a Christian? And I would encourage you to hit pause, think about it just a little bit, maybe write some stuff down. Go ahead, I'll wait. Okay. My guess is that most people who answer this question are going to answer in a couple different ways. They're going to answer it like, well, I grew up in a family that was Christian, and so I just kind of always believed it. Or I had an experience. I went to a camp or I went to a retreat and I had an experience about Jesus. Or they might be like, well, I'm an American, so I'm a Christian. Like, what's kind of interesting is like the way we tend to answer that question, why am I a Christian, is usually based on a subjective experience. It's based on something that's like just I know personally. But here's the issue that can run into is, well, then if you go talk to your Mormon friend, hey, why are you Mormon? Or talk to your Islamic friend or Muslim friend, why are you Muslim? Or even talk to your atheist friends, like why are you an atheist? Sometimes they're going to give you, or a lot of times they're going to give you the exact same kind of answers. So then the issue is this: well, if my Mormon friend is a Mormon because they had an experience and it led them to Mormonism, and I'm a Christian because I had an experience that led me to Jesus, well, so what's like, how do we know it's true? How do we know what's actually true about the world? Like neither one of those things, we kind of come to a place where we can't figure anything out because it's indisputable experiences. And if that's the root of our faith, then I think something's missing. Not just I think something's missing, I know something's missing. And that's where what I want to encourage myself and our teenagers is I want you to be a Christian because Christianity is true. Like, you know the evidence, you know that the claims that Christianity makes are actually true. They conform to what we know about the world. They match up with reality, and so that foundation is what lets you is what leads you into Christ. Um, James Warner Wallace puts it this way: uh, if you have an experience, like you might be true, you might accidentally be true, or sorry, how to phrase that properly. To have an experience, you might believe the truth, but it's merely accidental. It just happens to be that way. Um, Alternatively, if your faith is based on evidence, then you have more of what's called like a forensic faith or an evidentiary faith. Like it's stuff that you can hold firm to so that no matter what happens, like you know this stuff is actually true. It's the best explanation for the evidence. So I can walk in confidence. I'm getting there. We're getting to the whole can I know God is a real piece. So then the reason why I'm a Christian, I might have started off like when I first came to faith when I was 12. Like it was, yes, my parents believed it. Yes, I had an experience. Yes, I had heard a lot about Jesus, and now I kind of felt he was real. The word came alive, all these subjective things. But over the years, I began to learn that, well, actually, I'm a Christian because it's true. Because I know the world, I know that the claims that Christianity makes, there is a God. The scriptures reveal who that God is. They're reliable historical documents. Jesus really did exist. He really did die, and he really did rise again in history. The Bible are historical records of those things. Because those things, those claims are actually true. And so now I know that Jesus is Messiah, that Jesus is Lord. Everything else follows, and I am a Christian. So yeah, I'm a Christian because Christianity is true. So can I know that God is true? Well, God is real. Well, this is where we start getting into like what the evidence is. Can I know? Yes, you can. Because in the end, like what we're going to be doing is examining, well, what do we know about the world, and what's the best explanation for all of those things? What are the competing ideas that are out there? Well, the best explanation for the world, and we can get into the specifics of it, is that yes, there is a God. Like that's the best explanation. That's what the circumstantial and eyewitness evidence leads us to believe. So yeah, I know that there is a God. I know it for real. Now, are there days that I don't feel that? Yeah. I mean, can I talk to God the same way I'm talking to you right now? I mean, I can pray, but I don't necessarily feel like that there's that talk back that happens. But I am convinced that yes, there is a God. And yes, this God communicates with us. Yes, this God has communicated to us through his word and through other things. And so I can be confident. I can know for sure when I base my faith on facts, not merely on feelings.
Yeah.
To coin
Well, that's good.
someone
That's
else's
good.
terms.
No,
Yeah.
thanks. So, I guess a common question that I get is, I'll have students that will say, "Hey, I have this non-believing or agnostic friend," and they're like, "Hey, show me proof or show me evidence that your God is real." Like, and without any evidence, you know, I won't believe it. What would you kind of say to those friends that really want someone like, they're like, "Hey, unless you show me proof, I ain't gonna believe
Yeah.
it." How would you
Oh, yeah.
feel about that?
So what I'm going to do, sorry, someone came in my office.
No, it's good.
So someone says, hey, look, what evidence can you provide? I usually want to start with a question. I like questions. They're really important, and you really need to think deeply about questions. My first question is, well, what kind of evidence would be satisfactory? Like, just straight up, what kind of evidence would you accept? And I want to ask that question because I kind of want to know where that person's at. And in most cases, the kind of evidence that they're looking for, it's not reasonable. They don't ask that evidence of anybody else. It's like, oh, God, if God was to show up in front of me or was to write something in the sky, or okay, so like, do you believe that Joe Biden actually exists? He's currently the president, but do you know that he actually exists? Have you ever met him personally? Have you ever seen him or touched him? Has he ever written something in the sky for you? No, but do you believe But do you believe that he exists and that he's here? Well, yeah. Why? Eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence. So what's kind of interesting is I asked the question, hey, what kind of evidence would you accept if they have a really stringent rule? I want to show them, well, actually, that's not what evidence is like. Like in a court or a court of law, everything is evidence. Anything can be evidence. And it's all going to fall into either direct evidence or indirect evidence. Direct evidence is eyewitness accounts. Indirect evidence is all circumstantial. The stuff that people say and people don't say, the choices of words that they use, all the little artifacts all around there. And so when someone asks for evidence, okay, I can give you evidence, but let's just make sure that we're talking about the same thing and that you understand, or that together we understand that this is evidence can be anything. And what we're trying to do is trying to ask, where does this evidence point us? So again, James Warner Wallace is a guy I recommend a lot because he's really easy to understand. He is a forensic scientist. He's a detective, a cold case detective. And so he was an atheist and he came to faith later on in life. And the way he came to faith was through applying his professional principles of forensic analysis to the scriptures. And it led him to believe that this stuff is true. It's actual eyewitness accounts. And it's best explained by knowing that Jesus is the Messiah. So he talks about it this way. Talking about evidence. We have a room, right? And there's a death scene in the room. Someone has died. Now, that death scene isn't necessarily a crime scene. because it could be that the person died naturally. It could be that the person died accidentally. It could be that the death was self-inflicted. It's not necessarily a crime scene, it's just a death scene. How do we know the difference between the two? Well, if you can explain everything about the death from inside the room, like if all of the pieces of evidence point to the person in the room is the one that did this, or the person in the room is the only one able to do it, well, then you just have a death scene. But if you have to go outside the room to explain some of the evidence, like again, the example he gives is you walk into a room and there's a gun on the floor. Sorry, this might be a little graphic, I apologize. There's a gun on the floor, person's been shot. Okay, well, if the gun's in the victim's name, and if the gun only has the victim's fingerprints, and if the gun, if people knew that he had the gun prior to, like, you can explain it all within the room. Alternatively, if the victim hates guns and never owned a gun and never would have touched a gun, well, now you have to go outside the room in order to explain the presence of a gun, which means you now have an intruder, which means you now have a crime scene. Now, why that long illustration? Because as you look at the world and the universe, what we live in, the room of the universe, you've got all these different things existing in there, all these different pieces of evidence. And so now, can we explain those pieces of evidence by staying inside the room, or do we have to go outside the room in order to explain it? And so when people want evidence for the existence of God, let's start with that one. Well, you've got the origin of the universe. How do you explain the origin of the universe? William Lane Craig uses a thing called the Kalam cosmological argument, which states everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, what's the only explanation for the cause? Well, if at the beginning of the universe, space, time, matter, physics all came into existence, you can't use space, time, matter, and physics to explain how the universe came into existence. You need something beyond that, outside of that. So it's got to be timeless. It's got to be, it's got to be personal, permanent, and powerful. Permanent meaning it's got to be timeless and spaceless and eternal. So what explains that? Well, the best explanation is God. Okay, that's just one line of evidence, though. You might be like, well, I can explain it elsewhere. Well, then how do we explain the fine tuning apparent in the universe? Like life only, or sorry, our universe exists because there's some important numbers that if they were off by just a little bit, life would not be possible. The universe would not have formed. We wouldn't have the existence we have today. You've got the emergence of life. That's another strand of evidence. How did life emerge? How did organic life emerge from an inorganic system? You've got the appearance of design in life. We know that information only comes from intelligences. And so when you have something that we call a code, the DNA code, that is information, I'm just giving you really top level overview. We know that there has to be an intelligence involved. Can we explain that within the room through natural processes? Not adequately. So we have to go outside the room. We have to have a designer. We have to have an intelligence that gives us information. How do we explain the presence of an immaterial mind? Like, are you merely a brain and different brain states and chemicals? Or do you have something that's a part of you that continues on, immaterial, that makes you you, regardless of how old you are, or regardless of what goes on up here? It's the problem of mind. How do we explain consciousness? Are you a free agent? Do you make free choices? Or are you merely a product of event causation? Because my brain did this, I thus respond this way. I don't really make choices. I don't really think. I just react. That's stuff to really consider. Another strand. How do we explain that? Well, can we stay within the universe, space, time, matter, chemistry, physics, or do we have to go outside? A mind who creates us in his image. You've got the question of morality. All right. You and I feel there are things that ought to be done. Ought is a word that implies moral duty and obligation. The natural world isn't capable of that. When a killer whale eats a baby seal, that's not murder. That's not wrong. It's dinner. It's normal. It is. When a male chimpanzee rapes another, or sorry, when a male chimpanzee has sex with another male chimpanzee, it's not rape. It's just That's the social, it is. That's what the social, that's the social stuff of a chimpanzee. We don't have moral components. It simply is. But when this happens to us, human beings, if we club a baby seal, that's wrong. Or we club a baby human, it's definitely wrong. Okay, how do you explain morality then? It's another strand of evidence. So you have all these different strands, and there's plenty more, but just even in those, you've got like that's 6, 7, 8 strands, I think. What's the best explanation for all of those things? Is it a natural universe? It all happened within the room? Or is it best explained? And that's, again, we're using this best explanation thing, explained by someone outside the room, a personal, powerful, permanent, creative being with intelligence and who is good and who is a mind, who gives us free will. Like, that better explains things. And what kind of a being does that describe? Well, it describes what we typically think of as God. We typically would describe to as God. And so I start there. William Lane Craig, another guy I really recommend people read or listen to, talks about we have a web of faith. We have a web of convictions. And for a lot of Christians, the center of the web is something that shouldn't be the center of the web. It's often like the Bible is the word of God, which is true, but it's at the center. And so over time, as things don't seem to match up with our worldview, the web becomes undone. And pretty soon, as we attack the idea that the Bible is the word of God, our whole web of faith crumbles. So I think something better to have at the center is, well, is there a God? And that's where we get into the 2 books of, sorry, I'm just going all over the place, I'm sorry. Old historical people talked about 2 books of Revelation: the book of general revelation, and the book of nature, and the book of special revelation, the scriptures, and Jesus as a special revelation. I think that it's important to have both. And I want my center to be, well, there is a God. I know that there's a God. And because I know there's a God, I'm convinced of this. I know it's true. Well, now I can go and see, well, has that God revealed himself to us? And as I explore the Bible, or as I read through the Quran, or as I consider the Bhagavad Gita and the other holy documents, it's like, well, I think God has spoken to us. And the one that is historically reliable, that claims to be history and is actually reliable in what we can teach, or sorry, is reliable in what we can verify, well, then I'm going to trust this in what I can't necessarily verify. And that leads me to understand who God is, Jesus, and then we get into the resurrection of Jesus, like the historical event, which Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, like, if that's not true, Christianity isn't true, we're idiots, we're fools for believing this stuff, and we should just quit. So then to go in and to examine the evidence that, well, you've got historical evidence around the globe, not just biblical evidence, but other people. Jesus really did live. He really did die, crucified by professional executioners with the Romans. And then 3 days later, there was an empty tomb, and there was appearances. Like, people saw Jesus alive 3 days plus after his death. Those minimal case argument for the resurrection of Jesus. How do you explain the empty tomb, and how do you explain the appearances? Any explanation has to be able to do both of those things. And as you look at the options, the only one that makes sense of both of those is that Jesus actually did raise from the dead. So if Jesus really raised from the dead, something special about him kind of verifies what he said about himself. What did he say about himself? That he's God. He came to save the world. Why does the world need to be saved? Because of sin, as we learned the rest of the Bible. And that leads me to believe, okay, the claims that Christianity makes are true. Therefore, we can go with it. So the original question was evidence. What evidence do I give? What do you mean by evidence? Anything can be evidence. All right, now let's walk through all the different strands of evidence, which means that you, Ensu, or whoever else is watching this, you got to take the time to learn about the facts yourself. And there's stuff that you can do that with. Reasonable Faith, On Guard. James Warner Wallace, he wrote like 3 books, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and Forensic Faith. Read, learn, get familiar with all the different stuff. Do the deep investigation yourself. Most of all, I'm losing my books, man. Most of all, know your casebook. know the Bible inside and out, understand it. That way you know what the claims are and you can back them up. Other excellent books worth reading. Finding Truth and Total Truth. You're dealing more with the concept of truth here than you are with Christianity, but it applies. Greg Koukl's Tactics, really helpful in learning how to talk about this stuff. So I'm sorry, I've gone long.
No,
What's
it's
up?
good. No, it's good. No, thanks. Thanks for sharing those resources. I guess like the final thing is, yeah, just any encouragements for students as, maybe they have friends that, kind of question it, just how to engage, in a civil or in a loving way. Any encouragements
Yes,
for that?
don't be a jerk. But no, honestly, here's the thing with spiritual conversations, with talking about God with people. We can't assume people have a similar base knowledge anymore. It used to be that Christianity, like the Judeo-Christian ethic, was kind of like it worked throughout the culture. Not anymore. People aren't familiar with stories of the Bible. They don't have a basic understanding of theism or anything like that. So here's some of my biggest tips with this. One, remember that conversations don't have to end. They might take a break, they might pause, but you're not in there to win an argument. You're not in there to just get all of your stuff out there and one and done, no more conversations. If you're really interested in talking to your friends about God, then it's going to happen over time and it's going to take time. And so you might talk for an hour, you might talk for 5 minutes, you might take a break for a couple of weeks, you might come back and talk about it later. It's okay. Be patient, work through it. If it's not important to you, it's not going to come up. I can almost guarantee you that you want to talk about God, just talk about what God's doing in your life and how God's been changing you and about the stuff that you're learning. And it will allow you opportunity to talk about it with your friends. And then the other big thing is just ask questions. Like if you genuinely want to just launch into a conversation with a friend about God, start with questions. Like I said, this book, Tactics, is really good. It sounds a lot more negative than it actually is because pretty much all he says is like, listen, you're just going to be curious. You're talking with your friends about some moral issue. Hey, what do you think about God? Like, do you think there is a God? How come? You're going to seek understanding. You want to understand their point of view, because only when you actually understand their point of view are you going to be able to talk with them about it in a way that they're open to. You guys know how bad it is when someone assumes they know what you're talking about. Like they'll say, "Oh, Christians believe this." Well, actually, no, I don't. And it puts me on the defensive, and I don't want to talk to you anymore. I just want to get out of the conversation, or I want to correct you. And then now we're butting heads instead of actually conversing about this stuff. So ask the questions. Hey, what do you think about this kind of stuff? What do you believe? Why do you believe? And so some big questions that are important to ask is that he talks about here. What do you mean? Like, so if you say, hey, what do you believe about this? And they say, well, I believe that God is spirit. Okay, well, what do you mean by spirit? Like, ask those questions of clarification and definition. That way, you know that when you use that word, you're using the same word that they're using, the same meanings that they're using. What do you mean by that? How do you know that's true? And again, you can ask these questions in a way that you're kind of a jerk about it. Like, how do you know that's true? Is different than, well, no, tell me, how do you know that that's true? Ask it gently and kindly, because you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the reasons that they have for believing it's actually the truth? How did you come to that conclusion? Where'd you get this information? Like, you're kind of learning, are they getting this from their own research or do they just hear it from someone? Like, all this is important information for us to be able to engage intelligently in the conversation with them. And then if you want to, like, I don't like gotchas. I don't like sound bites. I don't like one-liners to kind of like drop the mic, I'm out. But you could ask like, hey, so what happens if you're right? Like, let's say you're right. What are the conclusions that draws you to? What about if you're wrong? Like, if you're wrong, what is the conclusion? And you kind of help them see where that's going. But as you ask those questions, you get to know them, know what they actually believe. Then you can, as Greg Koukl puts in Tactics, you want to put a stone in their shoe. Because I'm pretty sure that none of us have had our mind changed because someone said something or someone dropped the mic on us. But instead, what happened was they asked us a question we couldn't answer, or they maybe said something that we couldn't really refute or deal with. And so we had to go home and think about it. And it kept like coming up. And our mind was changed because we had to figure out for ourselves what we really believed about this stuff. And so If you're talking to someone about God, hey, what do you think about God? Well, I don't believe that God really exists. Well, man, okay, why do you think that? And what do you mean by not exist? And like, how'd you come to that conclusion? Well, hey, have you ever thought about like the fact that we're here? Like, how does that happen in a universe that's purely driven by natural forces? I'm always blown away by the precision that the force of gravity or the weak force of the atom or the strong force of the atom. Like with one, the universe could never have would never have stopped moving. Nothing would have come together to form planets. With the other one, we all would have super compressed. It would never actually have expanded as the Big Bang seems to indicate. What do you think about that kind of stuff? And again, we're just so that we're asking questions and we're putting stones in the shoe. And then yeah, sometimes it might be like they might actually ask, "What do you think?" And then you want to make sure you have an answer to be like, "Well, yeah, I believe there's a God, and there's like 8 lines of evidence that lead me to believe that. And there's probably more." And but if you don't know it, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to speak it on a regular basis. In the big and thing, another tip, I guess, for having a conversation with your friend, if your friends bring stuff up that you're like, "I don't know," just be honest. You know what? I've never thought of that. That's new information for me. Tell me more about that. Let me understand. And okay, can we take a break? Because I like to go do some reading and talk to some people about this. It's okay to say I don't know. Because again, conversations don't really have an end. They kind of just take a break and you keep going. But just know that as well, my final tip is recognizing that spiritual conversations are honestly a work of the Spirit. So you and I, when we're having these conversations about the evidence, about why we know that God exists, why the Bible is actually a reliable historical document, why, or set of documents, why we know the resurrection to be a historical event. Well, in those moments, like all we're really doing is we're kind of removing stones from the garden. But until the Spirit comes in and makes the seed come to life, it's helpful, but it's not like we don't save people. Jesus saves people. And we try to remove obstacles, but until the Spirit does the work, it's not going to do anything. So that means the pressure's off, and so we can share freely. Our responsibility is just to be faithful proclaimers of the gospel. So do it with confidence, knowing that you know what, in the end, God's going to take care of this.
Good. Yeah.
You asked the wrong guy, Ensu. I talk a lot.
No, that's okay. Thanks. No, I liked all of it. I mean, don't be a jerk. Ask some good questions, and yeah, definitely lean on the Spirit. So appreciate sharing your thoughts with us. I'll definitely share this, and hopefully